Warning, this episode does cover the subject of suicide. If you need help, please use the links in the episode information.
He was a farmer and he had a wife and I think a kid or two, not very well educated. He was, didn't speak much, and he was that, right? He always run into trouble, but I didn't notice really how badly he was doing. And one morning I woke up and there was this big ruckus on the floor. And he had gone to the company bathroom in the middle of the night and tried to slit his wrist.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app or join our emailing list at coldwarconversations.com.
Tilo shares his raw and powerful testimony of a young man conscripted into the East German military. He recounts the daunting prospect of being drafted into the Border Guards, an assignment he was determined to avoid at all costs due to his moral opposition to the Berlin Wall and the potential to be forced into shooting unarmed escapers. He vividly describes the intense medical and psychological scrutiny he faced from military officials and shares the ingenious way he ensured he wouldn't be placed in the Border Guards, a tactic that involved a bold statement of conscience in front of a military panel. The episode also delves into the harsh realities of East German military life, from the ritual humiliation of new recruits to the tragic story of a comrade's suicide attempt under the pressures of service. Tilo also describes working in an artillery brigade headquarters, an unusual tactic to prevent Allied military liaison missions from identifying their vehicles, and an attack on them by East German paratroops during an exercise. I'm delighted to welcome Tilo back to our Cold War conversation.
I was 16 or 17, I think 17. And I was going to get drafted. Everybody was going to get drafted. You had to not have a leg or something to be medically unfit. So I just got this little card in the mail and I had to report there at such time. And I went in there with one goal and one goal only, because at that time they weren't going to make you sign up for 3 years anymore. That ship kind of had sailed. So it must have been when I was 17 or maybe even 18, I'm not sure. But my one goal was that I was not going to be drafted to the Border Guards. Because, that needs no explanation, I guess. But my reasoning was that I hated the wall. I wanted to be able to go where I wanted, number one. So I didn't want to be a part of the system which stopped people from doing that. And secondly, I know that I couldn't have lived with myself shooting at someone and killed them for something which I felt was their right. That sounds a bit high-strung, but that's how I felt. I would have really felt guilty to have blood on my hands, which is bad enough, but in a situation like that. And I had an older boy from my Plattenbau who was living right below us, and he had been drafted, and he had told me that he was quite surprised that he found to end up at the Border Guards, but that it was kind of too late to change it then, and he just wished he could change it. And he felt the one or two times I met him, he just seemed very depressed, and he didn't even want to talk about it. And I had another classmate, or not a classmate, but in the older form of my brother, who kind of had the same experience. And so I was just, I'm not going to let this happen to me, was my determination. And there was a medical examination, pretty, very quick, get undressed, get dressed, this and that, And then I came before this board of, I think this time it was 4 people. There was an officer of the army, there was the doctor, there was a plainclothes man who didn't introduce himself. I'm guessing that it's Stasi, but I might be wrong, I'm not sure. And then there was an old guy, and this was typical at the time. Whenever, when the pressure was high, when they wanted you to make something, or when they wanted it to be festive, they rolled out some workers' veteran, they called them. This would be some old guy who had seen some kind of repression under the Nazis, been in the concentration camp, been in a jail, done this, done that, been in the Communist Party, and I'm kind of making light of it, but you got to give it to these guys. They stuck to their beliefs and they took incredible pain. They stood up for it. That was respectable, but they were being used for this purpose. They would be rolled out, sort of like, how can you, look at the pain this guy has gone through. But thankfully, the old guy did hardly say a word. So we just went through the motion, quick. They said like, okay, you know why you're here. Probably your dad already told you. Now you're going to be a real man. All of that, just to set the scene. And I scored a point there by mentioning casually that my dad had actually served, yes, but he served in the unarmed auxiliary troops, which was kind of a substitute for having a civil sort of a exemption service, if you will, which didn't exist in East Germany. What was the closest thing to it? If you didn't want to go to jail, but still didn't want to fight, then you went to be a Bausoldat. And that was exceedingly rare. Hardly anyone knew anyone who was a Bausoldat. But my dad did that, and I still am proud of it. But that put a sort of a hush in the room, like, oh,
There's no mention of this in your file.
I don't know. Their files were far from perfect, I think. But yeah, the rest of it went quite quickly. And in the end, the army guy just said, so do you have any other questions? I think expecting me to just say no and be done with it, But I said, yeah, I actually do. So what is it, Well, my classmates, some of them, they have been asked whether they'd be up for serving the border guards, whether they'd be willing if called upon. And you haven't asked me. So I was just wondering. So he was shuffling in his file, and sort of mumbling and saying like, well, if we don't ask you, then we probably have our reasons for that. But now that you mention it, would you be willing to serve in the border guards? He knew exactly what was coming, of course, but I said like, no, I don't want to do that, right? So I'm glad you're asking me because I don't want to. And then the army guy, he just started blowing up, He was giving me a dressing down, He was like, well, first of all, young man, let me make one thing clear. This is an order. These are the military laws of the German Democratic Republic. And if we draft you into the border guards, then this is where you're going, right? So just to set the scene. But regardless, we asked you no, but since you brought it up yourself, why? Why? Tell us why you don't want to go. And that's when the plainclothes guy started also, piping up. And that was kind of a similar situation to this teacher interview, I had already made my point, but they asked me this question point blank now, so I had to give an answer. So I just kind of said like, okay, from what I've been told, I could come into a situation where I have to use arms to stop people from going over the border. And that is just something which I couldn't do. I just couldn't do it. If someone is unarmed and they're running away from me, then I couldn't shoot them. I couldn't and I wouldn't, right? Oh, but the atmosphere just, it was just all up a level, then I'm not sure which, the army guy or the plainclothes, maybe they took turns, but they just said like, oh, but this is ridiculous. You're believing Western propaganda. And you know how many steps people at the border have to go through before they can even cock their gun and let alone shoot it. And then you shoot in the air, and said like, yeah, well, that's true, I guess, if you're telling me. But if all else fails, I guess you have to shoot. And so the army guy said like, well, if we put you in a infantry battalion and you're standing guard at the ammo dump, someone climbs the wall, what are you going to do then, right? And I said like, well, probably going to follow my order because I think that ammo dumps have to be guarded and it's better if arms don't fall into the wrong hands, right? Mm. And then the whole thing ended there, right? It was quite unpleasant, but not as much as in the school because I didn't know any of these people and I didn't ever have to meet them again. And I was very sure that I had this big black mark in my file. Don't send him to the border guards, which was all I wanted.
Yes, that plan worked. Did you ever consider trying to get into the Bausoldaten or not?
No, I did not. I mean, I considered it, but at the time, you see, my dad did this after his university degree because they still drafted him because he wasn't 26 yet or whatever. Mm-hmm. But for me to have go to the Bausoldat, I would have foregone going to university. And the atmosphere in the Bausoldaten and the discipline and the when you can go on leave and all that was actually worse than in your regular unit. So I'm not a pacifist, I'm not against people defending themselves. I think we have to have an army. So it was more the political purpose of the army, which I had a problem with. So yeah, I decided against it for these reasons. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure how my dad would have done it if he would have been posed the question before going to university, but then he would have still gotten the option to go to West Germany to study there. So I didn't have that.
So where are you shipped to?
Yeah, I'm going north. That was the general direction of travel because East Germany is much more densely populated than the south. But you want your military units kind of evenly spaced, like a Roman legion. So this meant that most people had to go north, and like people from Saxony went to around Berlin or whatever, and then we went up further north. Not that there was so much planning to that, but we basically had to be there at 6 o'clock in the morning at this train station or something, and it was maybe even earlier. I remember getting up very early, and my mom had said goodbye to me the evening prior because she's not an early riser at all. And I still remember grabbing my bag and listening to my Billy Bragg tape for the last time, because there was to be no tapes in the army. Salisbury Plains, right? Yeah, so I went there. By the time we got there on this train, it was a very long journey. Everybody got drunk. I didn't, I don't drink schnapps or that. I was barely 18, so. And then they put us on trucks in this little village east of Schwerin in the north of Germany and drove us into the barracks. And, people were hanging from the windows and cheering at us because there was this fresh new delivery of fodder to feel superior to, right? And then they pushed us into this big sports hall, and everybody got a brown tracksuit from the Armeesportverein with a yellow and red piping. And you had to lose your civilian clothes and put them in a carton, which you had to bring yourself already pre-addressed. And then that was taken away. And then we started getting processed and, got all the stuff. So I had gotten a haircut the day before. As I said, I went to these like punk and kind of new wave concerts and things. So I had very short hair. So I didn't have to undergo this ritual humiliation of getting your hair shorn, which was still prevalent in the 70s, I suppose. But that was not for me. Yeah, but I got really lucky, I have to say. I got lucky in the sense that even though I was in this artillery unit, which was nothing specialist about it whatsoever. The way it worked is that the more technical services and branches and units got to pick first. They picked your university track-bound people, your more educated people, the ones with the degrees, with this license and that thing, and so forth. And in the end, what was left was basically then for the motorized infantry and for the artillery. So we had a much higher proportion of soldiers who didn't have 10 years of schooling, but maybe just 8 because they were not up to it. And but I got lucky in that a soldier on a staff assignment needed a replacement because he was going to leave in half a year's time. And since he was in the regimental headquarters, he got to go through all the files of the draftees. And he was from Berlin. He went to this university track school, which was quite close to mine. And so he saw me and said, here's a guy I can probably get along with. So he picked me. And that was really lucky, I have to say. I spent one night in a regular unit, like a fire platoon with 12 guys. And, maybe in the Bible, they would say these men are the salt of the earth. But I'm very happy that I didn't have to spend more time there. Because the atmosphere was just so rough and uncultured, doesn't even start to describe it, but also violent, plainly. And they didn't have much time for an 18-year-old university-bound Berlin guy with glasses, who has opinions on things and reads Kafka and Huxley and whatnot. That was not the scene.
So did they allow hazing in or encourage it, or did it just was almost this subculture of that?
Officially, it was discouraged, but I would say that the structure lent itself to it, and the officers made use of it to further their career or because they were just complacent and lazy, right? So we got drafted in 2 waves per year, in the spring and in the fall. Service time was 1.5 years, and that meant that you always had 3 different service ages. Now, in West Germany, I know that they have these platoons or companies where they just train new guys together. But that's not how it worked in the East German army. We always had a mix of people. And basically, if you were of the fresh batch, then you were a nobody and you had to do all the shit jobs. And not only that, but just people made, hazing, just forcing them to do stupid, unnecessary stuff. Stupid rules, like as a new guy, first half year, for instance, we had these bunk beds, right? So bunk beds, and then like one like not even chair, but without a back, table in the barracks room. So pretty crowded. But as a new guy, you were not supposed to be on your bed unless between 10 p.m. in the evening and 6 a.m. in the morning, because to be on your bed meant that you obviously had spare time. So why aren't you out there scrubbing the floor or doing something, And you could be punished for that, not by the officers, but by some private first class or maybe corporal on duty. And the structural reason, apart from this mixing of different service ages, was that we had this ridiculously high presence level, which was 85% on combat duty. But the 15%, they're not all on leave on the weekend. Oh no. If you have people on sick, that just means that goes off the vacation rota, because you still have to have 85% of the people ready and present for combat. And in practice, this meant that as a grunt, as a regular soldier, in a half year, you maybe had 1 week of leave, and then you had 2 more weekends or 3 more weekends, and that was it. So there were guys who maybe they had wives and children, but they couldn't go home for 2 months on end or 3 months end. And they were just cooped up in barracks, and over the weekend and during the night, there was hardly any officer. There was an officer on duty, okay, but other than that, it was mainly corporals and then PFCs, and they just had the reign of the thing, and just this combination of boredom and frustration, some alcohol, even though it was illegal, and also just this tradition was being propagated by the people who had suffered by it. And that to me always felt like the worst, like people doing stuff to others just because now the roles have switched, now it's my turn to overlord it, that is really, I found that to be not only harsh, but despicable. I just despised some of these people for the way they behaved. And it really informed me, I think, of the things that people are capable of in certain circumstances, for sure. Yeah.
In your notes, you mention about one of your roommates attempting to kill themselves.
Yeah. You see that there were these minutiae, these little things which you had to do right. And if you didn't learn them quickly, then you were to suffer for it, right? And I'm a fairly quick learner, I know how to read the room, I know how to ask, I get along. For instance, just to give you a silly example, right, that there was a rule, an unwritten rule, that each piece of clothing in your locker, every single button had to be buttoned up, right? That's not part of the regulation. It just said the top button had to be buttoned up so jackets wouldn't slide off the hanger. But they just had this rule amongst them, many other rules, right? And then there was a locker check or a visitation, whatever. And this corporal just pointed out to me that I had forgotten to close 3 buttons. I had known about this rule up front, so I had closed all the buttons, but I didn't even know these buttons existed at the lower end of this greatcoat, so that you can, if you're riding, I guess, you can button up around your legs. I didn't know that was possible. So these were open. And then he said, well, you're a math kid, right? You're bound for university. So what's 3 times 3? I said, like 9. Okay, well, 9. Then you cut off 9 buttons off your uniform and sew them on back again. And if the light is off, you're going to do it by candlelight. You're going to show them to me in the night. Now, this is just one small thing, right? And I did it. I sewed them back on. And I didn't have to use candlelight either. But if you're just not getting it, right? If you're not understanding the rules and not know how to behave, then this is going to become really bad. And this is what happened to this roommate of mine. He was a farmer and he had a wife and I think a kid or two, not very well educated. He was, didn't speak much, and he was that, right? He always run into trouble, not by choice, but just because he was a bit slow and he didn't, couldn't row the program. And to my shame, I have to say I didn't help him. I kept my head down and was watching for myself to not, get into more trouble. And because we weren't a big group, in this room, we were just 3 new guys out of 10 or whatever. So there wasn't this overarching solidarity, this big group kind of pushback thing. And he had his locker kipped over, and had to rearrange everything. And he had to clean this and he had to clean that. But I didn't notice really how badly he was doing. And one morning I woke up and there was this big ruckus on the floor. And he had gone to the company bathroom in the middle of the night and tried to slit his wrist, basically. And by the time I got there, he'd already been carried off. But I still saw the pool of blood on the floor. Ceramic tiles with these ridges, like no slip, and like a couple of sort of like a page or two, the ridges were filled with blood, basically. I never learned what happened to him. They never told us. There was no, you would expect maybe your company commander to stand up in front of the company and say something about this event, put it in perspective or give some guidance or whatever. Nothing. Zero. To the contrary, when we marched down that morning to go to receive breakfast, we had to line up in formation. And us new guys, we always had to stand in the front because we were like facing the officers, because that was sort of under observation. And then behind us were the old guys, and then behind them were the middle guys. And they were joking. They said, this fucker, he's had it. Well, let's see who's next, and just... It really disgusted me, I'm sure there were some people who just kept silent, who didn't feel that way, but that was the atmosphere. And yeah, I never found out what happened to him. I hope he's okay. Some years later, I started a correspondence with a historian who was writing a book about a social history of suicide in East Germany. So he had access to files and things, and I asked him whether he could find out about this, and he couldn't find any records. So I don't know, but I'm hoping he made it.
I really appreciate your honesty in telling us about that. I think it's an important detail to be included in these accounts. So you said that Stefan had picked you out. What did that mean for you? Did you get transferred to some other unit away from these guys?
Yeah, that was this staff unit, as it were. It was, it was the whole thing, the whole unit. It was an artillery brigade. So we had towed artillery pieces, mostly 130 millimeter, a bunch of 152 millimeter. And it was a regiment in peacetime, but a brigade in wartime. So 90 guns, 90. That's more artillery pieces than the Bundeswehr has today. And it had a brigade headquarter, and there were just, like 3 soldiers in that brigade headquarter. And I was one of the lucky ones, I guess, because it was definitely easier than being at the guns. And I was a topographic draftsman. So in the war situation, I would be handling maps, like situation maps and situation reports. And we also had a radio, and always make sure that the situation on the ground is represented on the maps and in the charts, which we were keeping. Yeah.
Now, was the plan that West Germany was going to be invaded, or was it always the West were going to attack East Germany and then you were going to push them back triumphantly?
That's right, the latter. I mean, this is way above my pay grade, right? So obviously there was this propaganda about it, but right around, I should say 88 or something, there was this professed change in the military doctrine that this pushback would happen, but it would only go as far as the border. And this was also at the same time that 2 tank regiments were disbanded. So there was something to it, I guess. But yeah, I mean, we did in our trainings, because I took part in these staff training exercises as the lowest of the low, but still, I mean, we would go out there without the guns, just the officers with the radio networks and scouting them some positions. And on the maps, which I would draw on, we would always use the actual unit designations of the West. So there was none of that sort of, well, here are the pink forces, but we were red and the enemy was blue. And not only was it blue, but we had the precise designations. I can still, if I'm concentrating, I can still roll off the order of battle of the 6th Panzergrenadier Division, because that was our direct opposite. There was Landjut in the north and 6 PGD, and then kind of to the south and west came the Brits, basically, and we would always use the actual unit designations.
Wow. Yeah, in NATO, they were far more circumspect, although it was pretty obvious who the enemy was
Right.
at that time. What were the officers like in your unit?
Well, as with all professions, there's different guys, good guys, bad guys, mediocre, whatever. I mean, I with some of them in my staff position, that was really unusual, because I wasn't part of a platoon or battery or whatever. I was talking about wartime situation with the maps and all that before, or maneuvers. But in normal peacetime situation, as it were, we were just like a tiny office pool, right? So officers would come from the staff and they would have something to be typed up, or they would have this, because we didn't have proper copy machines, so they had this diagram and they wanted it to be enlarged or something. And we would do that. And oftentimes these were not our direct superiors, because we reported to the chief of staff or his second in command, actually. So we had some leeway of either doing something for an officer or saying, well, Comrade Major, I'm terribly sorry, but we're busy with this official task here. If you want yours to have precedence, please talk to the chief of staff, which they wouldn't do, of course, But so in that sense, it was not an even footing, but it was more of a negotiable position, if you will. And some officers I liked to a certain extent, and others were just you just try to steer clear of them, basically, right? I mean, there were some who did it for their communist beliefs, and I respected that to an extent, because at least they were honest about it. And others were in it because that seemed the easiest way out of a provincial setting or whatever. And even others were in it for the technical excitement of handling big groups of men hurling around, shots in the night or whatever, right? So I think apart from the first setting, maybe, or the first motivation, that's quite normal, right? So yeah, family tradition, even some had dads who also had been officers. Yeah.
And I mean, in your downtime, what did you do? Were you able to watch like Western TV or anything like that? Or?
Yeah, that was difficult because reception was very bad there for some reason. And I mainly, in my downtime, in the evening, we tended to not, I mean, we were in barracks, right? We were inside the security fence, but we were in the actual brigade headquarter building. All the officers had gone, and we had this office space. And I would stay there with Stefan and with one corporal and just, shoot the breeze, have a drink, listen to the radio, do whatever, because that was preferable than being in the actual barracks building, where you would run into corporals, officers, and whatnot, because we all had security clearance, as did I. Surprising to me, they went through this process and I thought, oh, they're going to find out that I have all these relatives in the West, and I had been to all these concerts, and I'm in a church. So what business do I have having a security clearance? But I don't know. They gave it to me, and that was cool because the whole room we were in had a security clearance because we had stuff lying about. So we were safe from your ordinary like patrol or officer or whatever, right?
Right.
So.
And what did you shoot in the breeze? What do you talk about then?
So just a couple of young lads. What are you going to talk about? There was this mix. You were either 18 or 19, or you were 26. Somehow there was no in between. And the 26 guys had typically already had families and kids, and it was a little bit harder to relate maybe. But the young ones, you could go on leave for the night, right? Not as a regular soldier as often, but we kind of could swing that, and then. But there was just a small village. We didn't have cars, and it was kind of hard to get around. So yeah, I had another roommate. He was an electrician, and he was working in this repair shop, and they were repairing, I don't know, whatever needs repairing, electrical stuff. And his fellow guy in a workshop was a carpenter, and the two of them. They were quite a pair. They knew how to get along. They were a bit older, and the carpenter had somehow managed to smuggle in pure alcohol, like 98% proof. And he would sell that. And it was totally illegal to have any drink inside the barracks unless you had a pass for the canteen or whatever. So I would sometimes hang with them in their shop and rebottle pure alcohol into mineral water bottles.
Wow.
None of that stuff for us, right? Because he was an entrepreneur. He got all the money that he was taking, and he was buying Cuban rum, the best of the best. Like I don't know, I forgot the brand, but it's still there, Havana something, and that was available in these high priced shops in East Germany. So he would get this top notch rum in, and your East German cola. And they didn't have a fridge in the workshop, of course, but I had the keys for the regimental staff building, so I would get ice cubes from their deep freezer. And then we would drink Cuba Libre in style. So
rum and Coke, or rum and the East German equivalent of
that's it.
Coca-Cola.
That happened maybe 2 or 3 times. I'm glorifying here. So most of the time it was just intensely boring, and I read a lot. I read a lot at home too, but.
Did you have any contact with Soviet troops?
Yes, but in hindsight, given the fact that there were like 500,000 Soviet soldiers in East Germany, surprisingly little, but they were all kept in the barracks. There was just such a bad history of Russian soldiers going about and looting and raping and whatnot that I think the only way that the Soviet command saw fit to control that was to basically treat their soldiers as prisoners, basically, and they could never leave individually, only as groups. But we had this partner unit, and we had them visit once, and we visited them back. And I just realized how bad my Russian really is. And I came back from the visit to their barracks feeling lucky that I'm in the East German army, not the Soviet army, because it was so... it was austere, it was run down. I have no idea what the regular food was. What they fed us was fine, but I think that was just more for show. But this whole atmosphere, these young guys with their heads clean shaven, sort of looking sideways. You just had the feeling that this is awful. People are just so fearful here. I didn't know anything about this hazing in the Soviet army at the time, but from what I read afterwards, it seems that it was way worse than in the East German army.
The notes you sent me, you talk about visiting a prison where Honecker was kept. Was this when he was held prisoner during Nazi times?
Absolutely, yeah. He wasn't a prisoner afterwards. Yeah, he wasn't in concentration camp. He was in a Zuchthaus, in sort of a high security prison, I guess, very harsh, in Bützow. But that's not why they took us there. It was not a remembrance trip for Comrade Honecker, but rather... And it was a recruiting trip, I found out, right? I had a university application for psychology. That was already accepted, and they just took a small group of us there and showed us the prison and stuff. And afterwards, it turned out that they had these interviews set up for us, and they had this interview with me, among others, and they said, look, why don't you go study psychology? That's fantastic. We need psychologists in the prison system. We're going to give you a lavish stipend, and afterwards you come work for us, right? And I said, I'll think about it, of course.
Yeah.
But that prison, I mean, I don't know about other countries, but it seemed a terrible place to be. Of course, it's terrible to be in prison, but it was like super run down. The prisoners were in uniform and had these like stripes on their back and whatnot. It just seemed very grim. It's nothing I wanted to be a part of.
Tell me about your experiences on Zyklus 89 exercise.
Yeah, so that was a division level exercise in April of '89, when it still felt as if the whole Eastern Bloc would still keep going for centuries, I suppose. And it was with a motorized infantry division and some supporting troops, among them us. And we got there. Everything always started in the East German army by an alarm. You were supposedly not to know that a maneuver was about to start, but somehow inexplicably in the morning at 5 or whatever, the sirens would be going and the lights would be blinking, and you were expected to be down on your truck in 3.5 minutes sharp. Of course, there were rumors up front, so you would typically know that stuff was going to happen, but not the exact time. So we just hurried downstairs, got our guns, and just got to the truck, which thankfully we had already packed the day prior. And then we drove to the railroad station, because bigger distances were usually covered by rail car. And then we got the trucks and guns and everything onto the rail. And that was pretty impressive for a young lad, because we had 2 trucks to take care of our section. One was this fold-out truck where the actual brigade headquarters would be on, and the other was a truck which had all the maps and materials, and also the secret stuff which was locked away especially. And I was giving these 2 flags, a red one and a yellow one, and I was supposed to walk in front of the secrets truck, which was a Ural, like 3 axles, I think, modeled after an American truck in the 40s. Very heavy. And this truck was so wide that it barely fit the railway wagons. And I was supposed to walk in front of it and give the driver signals left and right so that they wouldn't fall off, basically, because we had to go over quite a number of rail cars, because loading was done from the back, basically. And I just thought, if I stumble here, it was still dark. If I stumble here, some of the rail cars bash together. This is how you die in peacetime. So that was a bit scary.
And that's quite a responsibility, giving those indications.
Yeah, because the driver can't see a thing. They're up there in their cabin, they're looking down, and they have no idea how their wheels are situated in relation to the sides of the car. Yeah. Yep.
Wow. You managed to get them on okay then, I think.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, and then we took the train, basically, which did not have a passenger compartment. It just had like these rail cars with sidings, and just like you could put cattle in there or soldiers as you wish. It was pretty cold. We had this little stove in there. It all felt very 1930s, to be honest. And we took our train to the maneuver area, which was massive. Oh, I'm just thinking of one thing, because they told us before that there was going to be a danger of what's the name, British mission or some other, like foreign,
the British military liaison mission.
Whether it was going to be British or not, but some Western military mission was maybe prowling, I don't know. And we were supposed to cover up the tactical markings on our trucks. They had these signs and numbers and things, and we didn't have any stuff to do that with. So what we did was we just took toilet paper on order. We took toilet paper, and then we took a grease gun, like an actual grease gun, not a shooting gun. Put grease on the markings, and then just kind of pasted these pieces of toilet paper on it.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and so we went to the maneuver area, got off there, and then it was all off to fun and games, I guess, for I don't know. It was not a full week, I think, maybe like 5 or 6 days, I'm not sure. But yeah, and there was some rough sleeping, as you do in tents. It was very cold in the night in early April. And as the new guy, I would always pull the middle shift, I would have to be able to sleep from 10 to midnight, and then my shift would be from midnight to 2, and then I could sleep from 2 to 5. Anyhow, so I learned how cold and how tired you can be.
Were you given any training in what to do if you were captured or anything like that?
Nothing whatsoever. No, I mean maybe in like, I don't know, in theory or something, there was like a half a page about the Geneva Convention or something, but no,
Right.
nothing at all. No. I was going to say during that maneuver, we were part of the good guys, obviously, right? The blue side. It was the dastardly NATO, which was attacking us for no good reason. But there were actual elements, actual troops who were acting as the opposing force, and including aircraft. So I vividly remember I was told by one officer that I was to go to this crossing in the woods and go check out whether some trucks would already be there or not. So I was walking down at the side on this forest road, but on one side it was like no wood cover. And I looked up and I saw this pair of Sukhoi 22 multi-role earth attack aircraft, and they were just going past. And then one of them peeled off, and I thought, well, that's interesting. And he was diving towards me. I was like, what? So, but he was practicing, or maybe he was aiming for another point. I'm not sure, but those planes, when they are very noisy if they come so close to you. It came so close that I actually saw the face of the pilot as he was pulling out. So, and
it suddenly felt very personal.
Yeah, somewhat non-sporting. Yeah, and another thing was with opposing force. We were told that there's a heightened risk of there was a special word, diversant, like a special forces or maybe just partisans or whatever. You weren't quite sure, but at any rate, people who would not stick to the rules of war, and they would be about, and we would have to be on the lookout. And I had already dug my little foxhole, and I wasn't too worried. But then suddenly I heard this shooting, and it turned out that there were actual guys coming at us. And I later learned that these were people from the parachute battalion of the East German Army who were acting as the opposing force. And we had been given blank ammunition, so you could fire away at will. There was a special break at the tip of the Kalashnikov to go with that, but I didn't, because I was just sitting at the bottom of my foxhole, and I didn't want to fool up my gun, because firing blanks really just means you have to clean a lot, right? And just didn't feel like this playing cowboys and Indians, I guess. So.
What were your instructions if you were attacked? Were you supposed to destroy information or the maps or what?
That is a very valid question, but we had no instruction of that sort. I think it was kind of clear that this was, at the end of the day, just a maneuver situation. And, if it were real, then things would be different and dark quite soon. Yeah, so the Raketenabteilung 5, we were the 5th Artillery Brigade, so core level unit basically. And there was, at the same level, there was a core level unit for missiles, and they had tactical atomic missiles, and which I didn't know at the time, but we just passed them and saw them rigging up their missiles under this massive, tent doesn't even describe it. It was like a, I don't know, a third of a football field maybe, just kind of camouflage against satellites and things. So that was part of the mix, I guess.
A Soviet unit or an East German?
No, East German. Yeah.
So they would have been given nuclear weapons by the Soviets?
I suppose.
Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the podcast information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous support of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.